All right, continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to welcome back Chris Seggerman. Chris grew up in Northern Phoenix. After graduating in 1999 from ASU West with a degree in English and working for ASU West Express, he became the managing editor of the Bandera Bulletin in Bandera, Texas. He came back to Phoenix, worked for an independent newspaper in Sun City, and realized he was too introverted to be a reporter, as he likes answering questions rather than aggressively asking them. He has worked for the State of Arizona Research Library for more than 16 years, including the newspaper collection and the genealogy collection from 2007 to currently. He has lectured on newspaper research, examining and reading handwriting, as well as basic genealogy. He lives in Goodyear with his wife, Krista, two sons, Sam and Theo. Though outside the house, has stepchildren and step-grandchildren. He began working in family history early with a 6th grade project going back only 3 generations. Years later, he found an outline descended tree in a box of paperwork from his great-grandparents and worked his way down the tree until he found his parents, then realized what the document meant. He did not realize it also meant verifying the tree's author's sources, but luckily that man, a first cousin 3 times removed, got the facts straight. So without further ado, I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Chris.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
When I'm sharing my screen, the mute button kind of hides. So pretty much my Chromebook has the camera, but my Chromebook's Bluetooth is wonky. So there's a picture of me pretty much where I'm sitting right now. And I've got a tablet in front of me to take notes for questions and things like that. So a couple things before I start the presentation or the slideshow, people ask me, aside from the biography Suzanne just read, how did you get to be here? Usually when I'm doing the handwriting talk, like how did you get to be the handwriting guy? Well, before, I think it was about the same time I was doing the class project for genealogy in the 6th grade, I got this book on lettering from one of those scholastic book fairs. And I think that was an expensive book. So that was about the only book I could get that week or month. And a couple years later, I was copying out the letters in what they called Old English for a sign on my door that said, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," because I was that kind of kid. And then a couple years after that in high school, some friends said, well, you kind of like to do that lettering. Here, have a calligraphy set for Christmas. And I said, well, this set is fine. It was a Schaefer no nonsense set, but I kind of like to do that Old English stuff. And, you know, a little while later, I got a book that was Ken Brown's Old English. And so I did calligraphy for a while. And that was part of my skill set. Eventually got a book on medieval calligraphy because, oh, I want to write like the Book of Kells. I want to write like the font on the Highlander's sword, that kind of thing. And so fast forward to 2007 when I was joining up with the genealogy collection, and I said, well, I kind of can do handwriting and calligraphy. And everyone said, oh, great, I've got this for you to read. And it was the librarian there at the time. So I plowed through the thing and he said, okay, this was very hard for me to read. This is a good job you're doing. And then it sort of became, well, let Chris have a look at that. And sooner or later, someone said, well, we haven't had a handwriting talk in a while. Let's do one. And that was probably about 2008, 2009. And I've been giving variants of this talk ever since. So without further ado, I guess I'll get into the talk itself, present. Everyone still see me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one's kind of blank, but this is, I work for the State of Arizona Research Library. That's our current slide. I've redone this presentation enough that I just sort of want the official beginning and end slide, and eventually I'll probably get it to look prettier. But right now, this is what you get. Let's see, where's enter? There we go. So this is reading old handwriting, and I've got some old handwriting there for you. So I usually begin with this joke, and the quick secret to reading handwriting is something you learn by doing. So there we go. We can all take an early lunch. We can finish up. But how do you do that? What am I going to talk about? So a couple things. This is going to be a quick and incomplete history of European alphabets. I'd say Latin alphabets, no Greek, no Cyrillic, nothing like that. And advice on resources for particular countries' scripts. Before you begin, you ought to consider things on the document you're trying to read, like, where is your document from? So is it from some country in Europe? I had a question a while ago where someone said, well, my ancestors lived in the part of Russia that was settled by the Germans. So what kind of script would their document be in? And I had to think about that. Also, that affected when is your document from? Because were they speaking Russian? Were they speaking German? What were they writing like? The other thing is what kind of handwriting or script will it be in? A font is a different thing than a script, and typographers and calligraphers will both tell you that. The other thing is who wrote your document? Was it some kind of a scribe? Was it a clerk? Was it your ancestor? And the other thing that'll kind of help guide you is what kind of thing are you looking at? What document is it? Is it a letter? Is it a diary? Is it something like this document here that has a form and blank lines and you can read up here, and that at least is somewhat more legible? Yeah, this is baptismal for my grandparents and granduncles. So Leon Wilhelm Seggerman is my grandfather there. So to answer where, think local. And I kind of think really local, like it's an advice we get in genealogy all the time. You know, get down into the village, get down into the town square, get down into the county courthouse. But it'll help you figure out what language your document was in and get you ready for things like idiosyncrasies, which crop up all the time. And if it's a different language, you might want to have a dictionary in that language. And hopefully the dictionary will have a key to punctuation and things called diacritical marks. And you might want to find someone who speaks or read the language if you don't, because they might go, oh, I know what this is. You know, this, you wouldn't have gotten this, but here, that's what that thing is. So this is kind of with my background in journalism way back when, this is one of the 5, you know, your who, what, where, why, when. When will let you know the kind of handwriting it might be in, because they do have a timeline and an ancestry themselves. And going back again, language. So if someone spoke a different language there in that part of the country, and then they either left or got conquered or were forced out, that kind of thing. Who wrote the thing? Were they some kind of clerical professional? I found this image just Googling census taker. Were there several clerical professionals? A lot of the times at the state archives where I share the building with, we'll look at old marriage records, and the handwriting really depends on the clerk who was on duty that day. And sometimes I'll say, you know, wow, this guy really made his O's different. I'm going to take a picture of that. The other thing you might consider is it your direct ancestor? And this can have not only technical reasons for reading it, but also sentimental reasons. If it was a document they themselves touched, you might have the original, it might be on microfilm or an image. But I think for a lot of us, that's a powerful connection. Nathan Tardif, who's the guy who runs Noodler's Ink Company, always talks about this. He's like, you're leaving marks on the page that sometimes future generations, you know, 10, 20 generations down the line, if it's still there, it can still be read, that kind of thing. And you might see a mix of it. You might see, you know, the clerk wrote this part of the document and your ancestors might have signed. Sometimes they might not have signed, and you'll see things like X, and then probably in the clerk's hand, his mark. So the other thing is, what kind of document are you looking at? So you know where it is, who kind of wrote it, and it might help you look for spatial language. Like specifically, is it a legal document? Because legal documents almost, I would say, have their own formatting, even back when they were all manuscript. Is it a register of a vital event? Is it a letter or a diary? And the other thing when I say what kind of thing are you looking at physically? Is it something on microfilm? Is it a nice scan you can zoom all the way in on? Is it an original? And the other thing that what covers is you might be looking at something damaged. One of the examples I used to give was it was something like Indiana, but the top of the D was missing because there was a big water spot where the top of the D would be. The other example I could think of is in Arizona, we had a ton of marriages in Yuma County in the 30s and 40s from California because there was no blood test. But a lot of those registers got physically obliterated because they weren't stored in proper conditions and they got all black and moldy. So the scans are the easiest thing to search. And what we got scanned is what you want. You don't want to look at the original if you value your health. So moving on, this slide, I always do a little dictionary definition stuff. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, what he talks about Neo and Lithic, it's that kind of thing. But you've got paleography and orthography. What we're probably going to be doing better part of today, or when you look at old handwriting, is paleography, the study of old handwriting. And orthography is how the people wrote. Graphos means writing, like photograph, light writing. Dysgraphia, you have trouble writing. Paleo means old, ortho means correct. The other thing, handwriting considerations across languages. So for orthography, Wikipedia has a good category, and I had to change this link because it just to be European Latin script orthographies. And it says Indo-European Latin script orthographies. Oh, good. So if you go here and check this, you've got Classical Milanese, Catalan, Icelandic, Irish, ancestors from Ireland, Polish. You go to one of these, Polish alphabet, and it gives you things like that. It is Wikipedia, so you want to kind of verify what you've got, but I don't think people are going to be fiddling around too much with the definitions of, orthographies. Let's see, where are we? No. Am I in the other one? Let me go to here. See if it goes. The trouble is Zoom. Okay, there we go. So the other thing besides orthography is you want to look out for things called diacritical marks. And if anyone's, did we lose abbreviations? Okay, no, there we go, back. Diacritical marks are marks in languages that it comes from the Greek and it says to distinguish. And that means they change the sound of the letter they're applied to. And they vary from language to language. Like I took French, so I can think of the cédia on the C that makes it sound like an S, or the accent aigu that makes it make an A sound. And then the accent circumflex, which doesn't do much, but it used to mean there was an X somewhere in there, or I think an S. The other thing you want to watch out for in scripts are abbreviations and archaic characters. So anyone tell me what this thing over here on the left is?
Ampersand.
It's an ampersand. Does anyone know what the ampersand stands for?
And.
And. Do you know why it stands for and?
No.
Okay, there we go. I make my ampersands a little bit differently because that is an E shoved together with a T. That's the Latin word et, which means and. And if you look at some of the old ones, they very much look like an E and a T. So you'll have an abbreviation, which is et, and that became this thing, which is sort of like et, but is more like an abbreviated character. We still use it today. Okay, this one, this kind of word looks like P. That's not P, it's the. This thing is called a thorn, and it's one of the nicer looking thorns I've seen because it says TH. Where we encounter the thorn today, though, is usually in signs where you'll see what we would call ye old in or ye old whatever. And it doesn't mean ye, it means the. Complicating this is we have another word that's a perfectly good word that's also ye, and that's a second person personal pronoun. As Old English, Middle English, and early modern English. So in the King James, Matthew 25, when Jesus says, "Depart from me, ye cursed," he is not saying, "Depart from me, the cursed." That confuses matters. And it's sort of our usage of ye and the interchangeably kind of comes from that, because when they were setting type, they didn't necessarily have a thorn anymore, so they would use the Y. And it comes up again later. So abbreviations might look like diacritical marks unless you're sure they're not. And that's kind of you will know it when you see it and you'll learn it after a while. And they're the hardest thing to decipher. But if you look for context like charts and keys, especially if something's been transcribed or in how to read different languages in a manual, it'll be there. You might see if anyone's made a guide to similar abbreviations. I've seen them in the back of old books where they pretty much in type faithfully transcribed everything. And then there was like a secret decoder ring to the wills in the back because it was all more or less written by clerks and lawyers. Okay, so here's types of abbreviations. So there's brevigraphs, abbreviations in Latin, and you're a clerk, you're busy, you're doing your job, you want to save time. So I believe this is from Portuguese. I'll check it out because I've got this slide coming up later. But ligature is like et, they're two letters joined together. And you also see like professional abbreviations. And after a while, it's just kind of like, what did these guys, why did they do it this way? And it's usually like, the baker did it this way, or this is something that the church did from this time to this time. Speaking of the law, this is one I got from the Irish Cultural Center in Phoenix. So it's got a couple different things going on here. This one right here, well, okay, so in spatial characters, what do you suppose this is, this name?
Ross.
Ross, there you go. It's got the long S. So James, it's got the S at the end that works, Ross. And then how about this?
Esquire?
Esquire. So they didn't bother writing out Esquire. And the other one that comes up, notice this is, it also has in the year 1744. And for some reason, I find on old legal documents particularly, they still use the old THE. I don't know if they eventually decided it was the year or if this is a brevigraph or what, because they also have plain the over here. And I nearly always see it before something like in the year or in the case of, or it's almost like a clause separator. There was an old document that had this kind of stuff in a completely different script than the rest of it. No, don't exit, don't go back there. I'm using my mouse wheel. So the other thing that's down past the year is this word, which is mortgage. So MT gauge. And then you've got Esquire back again, estate. But if you didn't quite, this is a document concerning land. So lands, you're going to have things like mortgage. One of the first hard things I read for a genealogy librarian was a legal description of the land. And it was one of those meets and bounds states where everything is expressed in landmark, but also surveyors, rods, and chains. And so I said, they keep saying rods and chains a lot. Am I reading that right? Oh yeah, old surveyor stuff. I thought, aha, I better tuck that one away. So the other reading tips I have for handwriting in general is compare, compare, and compare everything. And if you have doubts what a letter is, look for other examples of that letter and see if they match. There was a professor on Twitter not too long ago who was asking for people to help transcribe a document. It was a Confederate officer's description of a camp servant he had. And I forget the exact thing, but it came down to W's and M's. And I said, well, he always begins, I was late to the party and everyone had transcribed it already, but I don't think anyone said his M's look like this. They nearly always look like this. That's not an M, that's a W. So look for things like that. The other thing is look for letters you can read as letters to decipher the letters you can't. Going back here, like you see things like, case of Lady Anne, and is that a J or a K? So if you go down and look for J's or J or an S, if you look for a capital S somewhere, that kind of thing. I think I have more of this, and now I can't remember if that is an L. Well, I know it's not exactly a J or an L because it's like that. But place names, look at maps if you know where your document is from, and look at the map and the language the document is in. If it's a French document talking about Brussels, it's not going to say Brussels. It's going to say Bruges. It's not going to say Munich. It's going to say München, that kind of thing. The other thing I suggest is learn the strokes the average writer would have learned to make their letters. And this is the calligrapher in me coming out. And if you have to, you can make a photocopy, or these days, you just got a graphic printed out and trace over the letters with a pen or stylus and see if you can follow how they're made. And I think this goes a lot easier for those of us who had handwriting in cursive in school. I wouldn't necessarily say calligraphy, but the other thing you can do is if you build an alphabet of that handwriting using every available document you have by that scribe in that handwriting, the more documents you have, so you can say, he nearly always makes his M this way, except if it's at the end of the word, then he makes it that way. So let's see, right now, writing utensil timeline. So I always do a little bit of the Office Max of yesteryear in here because I'm a pen geek, and there's a lot less pen geekery in here than it used to be. Thank me. You got reeds or quills up from the 6th to the 19th century. But, in the middle of that, you've got the printing press in Europe. Before then, if you wanted a book scribally produced, you had to get someone to copy it for you. And they were still doing this far after 1440. But, this is your timeline here. You've got pens with steel points, which make a huge difference in the amount of wear and tear you've got. They're also going to change the look of your handwriting just a little bit, because over here you tended towards broader nibs and the nibs would wear out and you could trim them. But over here, you could write for ages with this steel point pen. And people would talk about that and they'd say, this is great, I can write forever. Then someone figured out in the late 19th century, you can put a reservoir on the back of this steel point pen and a thing that'll keep it from leaking everywhere, and you can write even longer. Then about 1938, you had ballpoint pens, which are not as messy as fountain pens. And throughout all of this, you've had chunks of lead that you can write with, or graphite pencils. Don't get into cuneiform here or styluses, though you used to be able to write on wax with the stylus. So the other thing I noticed when people talk about quills is there's a school down the street from my house where they've got a quill on their sign. It's like Legacy School, and the quill looks kind of fancy, almost like a peacock feather. And if you ever try to write with a peacock feather, it's not all that handy. It catches the air a lot, the balance is off. So the quills you usually see by these kind of wig-wearing Baroque people aren't usually all that quilly. This is more like what a practical quill looks like. This comes from Edward Johnston, who was a calligrapher in England early 20th century. And he wrote a very good practical manual that's not in your bibliography. And I'll see if I can find it for you. But here's how to strip the shaft. Here's you lengthen the slit of the nib. So that right there is a little knife, pen knife. Here's what you do if your quill gets worn. So, eventually you write and they start to spread apart. That's another thing about this that I'll get into in a little bit, is people ask, well, how come the handwriting is so different today than all those pretty documents from the 1800s? There's a physical reason, as well as just people learn different handwriting. But, these nibs might require recutting. And so this is more practical quill trimming. This is from a book where, if you really want to learn how to hold your hand, it's the ancestor of those little triangular rubber grips that they have now. And I think now, so for demonstrating some of this, let's see if I know I need to be in this one. I'm going to escape from here for a moment and go to Curse You Zoom. Come on. There we go. Okay, so I think I got this right. Yeah, I'm cheating here. Is the sound on the video coming through?
I hear your voice, but I don't hear anything on the video.
Oh, good, good. There's not much sound. So this is a modern day calligraphy pen that has a chiseled shaped tip. And if you remember that quill, it kind of looked like the edge of a chisel as well. When you write like that, you have two kinds of lines. You got thick and you got thin. So some of those old scripts that we'll get into, that was about your basic stroke, and it took advantage of that. You had a diamond, a straight line, and a diamond. So they have games where the monks would get bored and they'd write things like minimum, all like that. But the same kind of line would get into another handwriting, italic. And so as time went on, that's how, and okay, it's gonna lag a little bit, but I was gonna do, oh, error occurred, then heck with that. It gets the point across. Back to this one, present, back where we were, yay. Okay. So the other thing for ink, what did they write with? Back in the day, like, you didn't go to Office Max or even get your stuff from Carter's. They had, ink you could get in tablets, but 1800s, I've heard walnut shells dissolved, lamp black, that kind of thing. Jane Austen had this stuff, blue galls, gallic acid made from oak apples, iron sulfate, gum and copperas must be beaten in a mortar and put into a pint of strong stale beer. So when you think about your ancestors in Jane Austen's time period and how they wrote, or think about your ancestors if they wrote something out on the frontier where you couldn't get ink handily. They might have a pencil because it was easier to make from ink, or in some householding manuals, you would have ink recipes because you'd need it because there wasn't any other source of ink. If anyone wants to know what oak galls and gall wasp look like, this is where you'd get your oak galls also. I believe this from Wikipedia. I was in Sedona sometime last October, and they actually had this on the tree. And I said, let me get a picture. I'm going to see if I can get this for the lecture. Look, there's the wasp. There's the wasp. But this is a nest that the wasp would make, but the acid that it would inject into the tree to make the nest is what gives it the chemical that also would make it suitable for ink. So getting into text and hands, I used to have one I did, but I got this off Wikipedia and the credits down below. So on your old Roman things, this would be carved into your monuments, but handwritten, there would be rustic. And then the Greeks had a form of uncial. Then you've got uncial here. Lots of early biblical manuscripts when they're written in Latin and uncial. But down to about Carolingian and in here is where things go Gothic. Insular is old manuscripts in Ireland and Wales, Celtic manuscripts. And then your printing press is somewhere about in here because you've got humanist. So there's a quick Latin paleography resource, and I don't have it open now, but if you got this and follow the link, there's a guy down here, Manual of Latin Paleography. And this is by a guy who's more or less trying to sell you his font package. It's okay, it's very well done, but throughout this, he has examples of where he pulled his fonts from. So it's look at my medieval and Renaissance fonts. So if you want to see samples of those, it's great. And he's, this is what he's doing, so he doesn't necessarily care if you download it or not. It's his sales brochure. But into Gothic script, which is about the first thing I picked up calligraphy-wise, it's called Black Letter Old English, and it has that regular stroke. And what I found actually is you can cram a lot more lines in one page. So if you're a monk and you don't want to use up vellum as fast, that's a good way. It's supposed to be more clear, but sometimes it's not legible. And it descended into Gothic Littera Bastarda, and it became Batard in France and Fracture in Germany. And we'll talk about that when we get into German handwriting. So for some examples, and this goes back to the whole ye, thee thing. This is written in English. This is Middle English. So down here it says, considering that the ghostly living of all. And I thought, how the heck you've got life over here, the blessed life of our Lord. But down here you've got thee. That's not yet, it's that. And I thought, how did they figure this out? Life on this one always has that little kind of V-looking thing and a very, thin, short tail. That and thee don't have the short tail. They go down below the line. But if you didn't know what the heck a thorn was, if you didn't, say, okay, well, look at like something like church or the apostle, the words, the foresaid, there's another one. And also long S, and long S looks like that in this particular handwriting. It's also got the regular S at the end of the lines. So Gothic, again, sort of less legible. Sometimes as it gets more sort of cursive and run together, it's more legible. Sometimes it's less. If there's any Chaucer fans out there, here's the Canterbury Tales. So this is whole one that opera with his sure suit, the drolte march had pierced to the route. And you can see it's not getting straight anymore. It's got all these little fine lines and curly cues. And I found things tend to go from rigid to a little looser. The other thing you'll find that's kind of descended from Gothic, besides German, is secretary hand. And it's faster, but it's not necessarily legible. And people say, well, these were the secretaries. How come your secretary couldn't write clearly? Secretary comes from secret. You didn't necessarily want your secretary's documents to be out there. So, you know, there were whole professions where if you were a secretary or if you were a law clerk, you had hands particular to it. So this text is in Latin. I'm not going to make any pretense of reading it. There are guides out there for reading secretary hand. There are probably college textbooks on paleography for medievalists and things like that that could give you a hint. I believe that would be legalis, but that's secretary hand. After that, about Gothic, they got tired of that, and this was getting into the time of the Renaissance. So this is humanist minuscule. And they thought we ought to have something clear where the forms are a little bit easier to read. We want something, you know, that's a little bit like those old Roman forms. Remember, they were rediscovering all the old architecture. Side note, one of the good copyists of the day, Poggio Bracciolini, was a manuscript hunter. And so a lot of the Roman Latin manuscripts that we have that were carried down in monasteries, he would go and find in their book histories and literature that we wouldn't have if not for him. He's noted for having a very fine, clear humanist hand. Because you couldn't just, you know, you got a printing press, but you can't drag it into the monastery with a bunch of monks who probably aren't quite sure what you're there for or looking at you suspiciously. Italic script follows that, and it developed from humanist minuscule. It's faster and it has fewer strokes making up each letter. And the other thing that's different and new is it slants about 85 degrees. And remember back in the example when I had the video, that slant to it. And with the slants, it's a little bit easier to run letters together. Sometimes they call it chancery hand or chancelleresca, but it's different from another chancery hand. And you can look up the difference between the two chancery hands at your leisure. But here, Leonardo da Vinci, who is famous for writing backwards, the mirror writing, this is in italic, and this is written forwards to the Duke of Milan. It was sort of a job description, or he was hustling for work and said, look, I could build you all kinds of fortifications and weapons and that kind of thing. I believe it was one of the Sforzas. But here also, you know, you still have printing press, but you also have an italic manuscript that's illuminated. You've got some of the more Roman script up there. You've got something a little bit clearer here, and then someone who is writing really fast, maybe for themselves over there. You also have a line that's crossed out. I kind of like that. It's illuminated manuscript, but something crossed out. The other thing you might see in old documents is they might cross something out and write something up above because they got it wrong and there's no erasers. But you also see lines here, and it was probably this guy who was a second person commenting on the thing itself. They leave a lot of room and margins in their books. So getting into more what we would be calling modern handwriting is English roundhand. And people call it copper plate because they'd engrave it on copper plates. And it came down from italic, and it has that slant. And the famous example is in something called the Universal Penman by George Bickham. And he didn't do all the writing in it. There's a couple other people who are listed by name as you go through that book. But here apparently is Bickham himself. Here's the Universal Penman, so it's got that Gothic bit, or the Art of Writing. And people would spend hours just figuring out how to do these flourishes exactly, you know, symmetrical and lovely like that. So here's a sample of handwriting from the Universal Penman, and this would be considered something called a writing manual. You may or may not have had a teacher, you may or may not have time to go to school, but if you're a young fellow looking to improve yourself and go into the clerical trades, you know, you can buy a book. You can buy something printed like this and improve yourself with it. And, you know, it even says so down here, as a legible and free running hand is indispensably necessary in all manner of business. I thought proper to introduce these examples for the practice of youth and their more speedy improvement. 1739 GB. But the other thing notice is called a running hand. Latin verb for running is currere, and in medieval Latin it's cursivus and cursive in French, and you can see where this is going. Cursive comes from running, and that means that's a hand that you can run together. So round hand, this is another writing manual, but here are your strokes. So if you're trying to figure out why they did that or break it down, you could go down, you go down and over, and then you could down and go over and come back, or you could start up and then go over. And so you can see kind of Z is different. This is different. The S is way different. But you had these lines up above and down below, and then it shows, okay, here's your strokes. Here's the strokes kind of combined. So this is stroke 1 and stroke 10. This is stroke 2. And this is how you get the basis of your handwriting. I think today we go letter by letter and we don't necessarily go stroke by stroke, but things like the M and the N do better that way, I think. Let's see if I can get to second video. Okay, there we go. Let's see if it will run and not error out. So people say, well, does it make a difference like the pen they had? And I'm cheating here because I don't have a quill. This is a dip pen, but it's a steel dip pen, maybe like Bickham used. And those tines that the nib is made of, as you pull that way, they spread apart. So you get those thick parts and those thin parts. The other thing about those tines is you're not really kind of pushing down, you're pulling it towards you. And my hand, the angle of my hand is off because I was more or less straddling my tripod and my phone when I wrote this. But I just kind of wanted to give you like the effect of what that was like. So if you got a B or a C or a D, that's how they got those sort of thicks and thins. F. I think the only one that they really sort of did not join up was the S, but there you go, your I, your J, your K. I probably stopped about there. I don't think I went to M. Yeah, there we go. And I also got the ink bottle on there so you could see that. Hazards of the course, come on. I'll close this out and maybe there, I'll get to this one back. There we go. So like here's a document from 1761 that mostly, has some of that stuff. And came is really bigger, but the other thing about those flexi pens back in the day that you could do is you just pull down harder and they'd spread apart farther. But also, is this Jacob Seedy or is this Jacob Leedy? Well, son is capitalized, Erit law is capitalized. Down below, land is like this. So that's Jacob Leedy. The other thing that shows what you want to watch out for in documents like this, and that I don't particularly like when scribes did, was York County goes like this, and then the swash on the C goes all, and the D goes like that. For some reason, these folks like to do their Ds like that, and I've never quite figured out why, because if you remember that thing, you do the D and go up. And if you do the D this way, you have to move your hand clear back that way and do it that way. And if you're a busy working clerk, why would you go to all the trouble of, making the flourishes? I guess if you're bored or something like that, but a lot of people made their Ds that way in script like this. No, deceased does not have a D that way. Died does not have a D that way. So I don't know if every so often, if it would be on land or something like that to make it fancier, but also just on and, and doesn't need to be fancy. Here's another one that's a little bit more atypical than this because it doesn't have a slant. And I just kind of found this really interesting because, let's see, this is imperfection. And so that's an IM, the P, like the P's are not closed. So, this is periods, but officers down here. But so you've got an F and a P that looked a little alike, mentioned that M and those, when the N went down like that, or this particular scribe didn't feel very much like closing their A's half the time. So you'll find a bunch of A's where, let's see, precise length of his actual there. It starts out with a little curly Q and goes like that, and then does one of those little fat lines down like those N's. And, people would sort of learn a standard way to write, but they would just eventually do their own thing. This person also really seriously believed in crossing their T's. When they'd crossed that, they didn't fiddle around. They crossed that, the T and T there together. Notice also right here, Schoharie County gets really light because you run out of ink. But for US scripts after that, you've got Spencerian, and it's 1850 to 1925, and it's got really big shaded and swelled capital letters, and also ascenders, the things above the line, and descenders are shaded. And you see it now in the Ford logo and Coca-Cola logo. And I thought I had a slide. Oh, okay, here's the Spencerian slide. So Buffalo Wednesday, January 1857, but mostly capitals. You don't see every, look, the shading and the swelling is not on a lot of these anymore. Going back, Palmer method is in Palmer's Guide to Business Writing, 1894. So it's not so much a script, but it's a method where you figured out how to use more of your arm muscles, less the fingers, but it's plain and speedy. Because also around 1894, you're starting to compete with something else called a typewriter. But the other thing I'll tell you about arm use is you get a lot more, if you're writing a lot, if you use your arm more, you shouldn't feel the cramping in your hands. It goes more back to your upper arm and shoulder. And there's some Palmer method letters. None of that swelling anymore. It still has the Q that looks like a 2. And it took me a while to figure that out. And that's because it's just like, if you stretch that line over, that looks more like a Q, and it's probably just faster. Here's a warrant deed from 1881 that looks a little bit different. And, people will say, well, does it matter the pen they used? And I'll say, well, more or less sometimes no, it might affect how it looked. And so I kind of find these things and squirrel them away. And then a little while later, someone had an Esther book catalog. And, so here you've got fine pointed stub pen, backhand writing, good pen for business here, but rather coarse pointed stub, very smooth, easy in action. And that's a probate 313. If you go back and kind of look at that, it's, may not be the same pen or model, but, why would someone write like that? Probably because of something like that. Let's see, I think this is the last one. So, but this is a 313. And I got a couple of these because Shelby Foote, who wrote the Civil War narrative, famously wrote with these. So there's a stub nib, and it's going to have the problem that dip pens have. You have to keep dipping the pen. And this ink came with a set of, pens like this, but it could be, fountain pen ink, and that would flow faster. That kind of thing. But it will give your lines, if you write that way, like very thin parts here, very thick parts there. Okay, there we go. And here's a couple. So if you wanted to do the old Spencerian script, they had one for that. Palmer, business in college. So if you're going to business college, and it even says, good size, splendid action, wears well. You don't want your pen wearing out. So we went through some of the American scripts, and now we're going to go back into German because this seems to be the big bugbear of handwriting. And German scripts derive from Gothic instead of Italic. And it's currently, I've seen current or current Schrift or Alte Deutsche Schrift, and used in the 1800s. And then there was a script called Sutherland that was based on current Schrift and by a guy named Ludwig Sutherland. And it was taught in German schools 1935 to 1941. And after 41, they decided, oh, this is a debased script and we can't use this anymore. And so here's letters in current, and I've got that there. But you can kind of see some of the Gothic shapes, at least for like, C, that's that jagged, spiky looking thing. You've also got somewhere down S, T, Z. They've got the said, the sharp S, that kind of thing. The best book I've ever seen on handwriting, and if they had one for every language and every script like this, the lecture would be very short, and I'd say go out and buy these books and we could get away and you wouldn't have to talk to me or hear me. But this book is Deciphering Handwriting by Roger Minert. This is the older edition. So the link here should work for his new one. So far as I know, he's his own game. He's the publisher, but this is one of the best books on handwriting I've seen, bar none. And so a sample page, so I'm not really stealing his thunder, but this is in the 2001 edition. It's page 17, but they go letter by letter. It has examples in German and Latin and French because territories would move back and forth. But this has the S, 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 and I think it's also got the Z. And it says 3 variants, and each has its specific purpose if the scribe observes prevailing spelling conventions. And you will get scribes who don't. Even though German spelling was not standardized until the late 19th century, and think about all our different spelled documents from the Revolutionary period onwards. But there's a sample. So here's another German script sample. My cousin wanted me to look up some old birth registers, and I thought, aha. So here's something that's particularly not legible to me. And since I hadn't spent much time reading German, I did not bother. But one thing I noticed is 1842 here is legible. This seems to be a bit more legible, but also down on the same page is this. And this is a bit more legible and also kind of reminds me of that handwriting from the 1850s. So, and this was on the same ledger, different scribe. So not everything in German is written in current. So here's Suderland if you want to see how legible it is. It also has the 4 S's. I don't think I put a letter guide in here. So what about handwriting besides German, besides US? And there's another letter that's jammed together. It's called an interrobang. So BYU has a great script tutorial page, and I used to do this presentation once died. The flash drive it was on failed right in the middle of it. And I said, well, we can just go to this web page. So the BYU script tutorial is here. If you take nothing else, go here. If you're a student at BYU, you could use that. If you're a researcher, you could go here. If you're an indexer, go here. But so paleography, study of old handwriting, there we go. So choose your tutorial, German documents, French documents, Portuguese. So you can see it in English and Portuguese. I told you, teams, go away. Sorry, y'all. That's my work, seeing that I'm here. But so Portuguese records, types, but notice over here, alphabet, Portuguese handwriting, history, and hey, court hand, secretary hand. Examples. So not only will it tell you, italic hand, but it will tell you what it's called in Portuguese. It'll give you samples of it. So you remember some of their secretary hand, their version of it, which sort of looks a little like the German hand. And after a while, these things, at least for me, can blur a little bit, but let's go back. So I don't think I'll get down to, well, let me go back in Portuguese and see if that link is there. Documents, bibliography, there. And I'll probably leave this tab open and go back. So there's a page if we didn't have good web access. One thing that I was about to click on there are records extraction guides. And so they're very explicit for reading handwriting and extracting information from them. So this will be particularly interesting to genealogists. And they're the most specialized manuals I've seen in my years researching this topic, off and on. So as of this writing, it has links to extraction manuals for Scandinavian, French, and Spanish records. This one's from 1978. So if you go, yeah, there it is, records extraction guide. Hopefully the link will be there. Yeah, so there it is. So if you want to look at the handwriting there, the alphabet, I think it opens it up as a PDF. It'll probably take some time. The other place you can look for these is on the Family Search catalog. So while that does its thing, I'll go ahead. If you go to the Family Search wiki, the other thing you can find is videos. So if you're more a visual learner, if you want to learn handwriting that way, the Family Search wiki does have videos. So if you go to Family Search wiki, which is somewhat more robust than just Wikipedia and specialized, because Family Search is keeping track over it, Iceland handwriting, that kind of thing. Let's see, back there. So Not quite to questions yet because I wanted to let that load, but it's going to do that Heidi thing for me. But if anyone has any questions right now, there we go. So sample letters in Portuguese. Does anyone have any questions?
I'll let the class unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask your question.
Go for it. I mean, anyone.
And while they're thinking about it, boy, the one thing I've learned so far is that my genealogy book collection at our library is sorely lagging in this topic. So I'm definitely going to start buying some books off your bibliography.
So some of the books there, I usually get what I call the philosophical questions, and people will say, what about the young people these days that aren't learning handwriting? And so there's a couple, 2 or 3 books there that are on I think one is Script and Scribble, that sort of cover this. There may have been a couple more recent ones, but it's sort of like, I used to have less of a dog in this hunt than you'd think, because that young man who's holding my old Schaefer is 9 now, and he's running up against this trouble because he's having a lot of trouble with handwriting. It could be something like dysgraphia. And you know, the opportunities for kids, especially now during COVID times, to get one-on-one instruction isn't there as much. But some of the things they're saying is, well, let's learn to type instead, or could we do voice to text? So you see things like sort of handwriting as a vanishing art. Particularly for me, when I was a reporter, I found taking notes on the subject by hand helped me concentrate. So it probably varies from person to person. But I would definitely look into the German handwriting book, and the standard book is by Kip Sperry, and it's okay. I think personally it could use an updated edition, because a lot of these books are little, cheat sheets you'll get will just be on about the size of a 3x5 card, and it's just, here's the letters in German or Portuguese and whatever. But
at work, I've actually got some old handwriting samples on my clipboard, not my clipboard, but my corkboard on my wall at work, just simply for that very reason. And when I'm trying to, to decipher something, I look at these little cheat sheets I have. But I think having a book or books on the topic would be much more beneficial. Now, Sarah, one of the students is asking, is shorthand related to secretary hand, or where does it come from?
So shorthand is more like a code, and I would have to look that up, but it's not necessarily related to secretary hand. Like you can't draw a straight line one to the other. I know Pepys, the diarist Samuel Pepys, wrote in a form that they call shorthand, but I don't know if it's the same shorthand or not. I'd have to look that up. But it's more like a kind of a code, and it's more based on phonetics than it is letters. If that makes any sense, like if you picture that Thorn, that's a TH in one character.
I know I've always struggled, especially looking at wills, looking at old handwriting, of course, and also with census. I've kind of been doing the technique that you suggested about, not only, practice, but also looking for other samples, in the same handwriting, like on census records. So frequently, reading the handwriting on old census records is really, really difficult. But like you said, going and finding other samples of the same letters will really help you understand what the word truly is on a census record.
The same census taker too. So I've heard of genealogists who actually stock census takers as much as their own family. Like I believe I wrote an article. There was an article we had that in one of our old newspapers about the 1940 census, and the picture they had of the census taker was a man. And I went and looked at the census page itself, and the enumerator was a woman. And I thought they staged that shot. It was something like an 11, family with 11 children.
Yeah, definitely. We do have another question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me see if I can escape out of the big size of this so I can see the chat, or go down to Zoom now. Okay, do we have, let me exit out of this. There we go. Now let's see if I can see you all, or show active speaker video. That's the minimize. Okay, so where's my chat? There we go. No, I don't need. Okay, so there we go. Thanks. Shorthand, meeting of checks, and smearing as a lefty, but don't have a bad slant. Yeah, I've heard various things about people who are left-handed and adapting to fountain pens, like a hook. You know, they would, I don't have a camera, but they would reach over. So does anyone else have any questions?
Let's see here. Sarah also says, I know that I had to adapt with ink pen smearing as a lefty, but don't have a bad slant, laugh out loud. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that, going with the right hands is not a new thing. It's probably been around for a long time, trying to get left-handed people to switch over to the right.
Yeah, I mean, probably if you're left-handed person, then you have jokes about being sinister. And that's, we get the bad connotation of the word because people with left hands were, thought to be untrustworthy or something. But, there's different, I think, strengths. I've never tried to do something left-handed, but I've been wondering if I could give some of those a try and if the strokes would be any easier if you could go backwards on some of those. One of the big things with this one back here, and go, no, I'm not going to do that. But with the dip pens is you can always go down and you can always go down into the left. You can't necessarily go up and to the right because the pen won't flex that way and you'll like spray ink everywhere. So if you've got a left hand, probably your trouble would be going, you can easily go down into the left, but then it's like not smearing the line as you go. But I imagine that down into the left might be a bit more natural.
In just speaking from my own family tree, one thing I learned many years ago when I first started genealogy about the different kinds of period writing was the last name, the surname Bassett, Bassett. And it looked like a backwards F, right before the second S. So it looked like it was pronounced Bathset, but then by doing some genealogy research, on handwriting, I found out that when it was the double S, you had that backwards F before the S, and it explained it. But it sure was confusing for me when I was a beginning genealogist.
I saw there was it was the U.S. Constitution is printed in the Pennsylvania packet. And, the typographical long S also looks like an F. And I thought, Pennsylvania packet, what are they doing here? And, sometimes like the long S makes, Zoom is always trying to get me. There we go. Okay, go back. Sometimes, I think it was in this one. Yeah. Let me minimize this one. No, not share. There we go. Present. So this one had the long S and that. So here's scripta for the Latin. And notice they've got the C and the R run together. So their long S's look like that. And it's still kind of F-like. But I wish I had the italic long S I saw because it made sense. Because instead of like specially where that, it looked like an S all the way down. It just looked like a big swoopty S that took up the better part of the line. And I thought that looks like an S. It doesn't look like an F.
Definitely. I took a class last year at Roots Tech on old handwriting, and I got to tell you, it was one of the hardest classes I took the entire conference.
They had a lecture by the people who did the BYU Scriptoria page. And I wasn't even able to get in there the first time because it was so jam-packed. And so I think it was either the next year or the year after that, I probably left the session before early so I could stake out a spot. And they went through the website and, everything was going good. And I in this talk before, I thought I probably got too much about calligraphy. I have too much about pens. And when they got to German handwriting, there was a whole section, at least on their let's see, exit. There was a whole section in the BYU site right there on German handwriting. And they had a whole section on pens. And they said, we tell our students to do this. We tell our students, like, try writing this as you would have written it. You know, techniques and tools, basic guidelines, full chart, Gothic handwriting. So samples, and I think they've kind of taken that part out. But the other frustrating thing for people, I think, in the audience was they said, well, you've got all these things about medieval handwriting and things like that. What about American handwriting? And they looked and said, you know, European handwriting also. And they said, by the time we get to American handwriting, that's kind of simple for us. And there was this kind of dismayed groan through the crowd.
Well, I know several of my students are at the point where they're crossing the pond, and they are starting to look at records in foreign languages. I get a lot of questions on my Saturday one-to-one sessions about handwriting from the European countries and the East European countries. And this is something that I think is not only valuable to me, but valuable to the class too, since I know many of my students are at that point now where they're looking at those Portuguese records, those
Spanish, French,
Scandinavian records, Polish. Yeah, I mean, just all over. My class has ancestry from all over that part of the world.
Let's see, some of these links I think they might be not there yet, and they always say come back or we're working on this. So it is something you do want to come back to. Like there should be a link for a records extraction guide there, but it's not doing anything at the moment. The other thing I found is if you go looking for records extraction guides, sometimes they're on the Family Search Wiki, or if you have access to, if you're a Family Search Partner Library, if you go looking in the Family History Library catalog, you can sometimes find them that way.
And by the way, we are a Family Search contracted library. So yes, but of course now our library is not right now open to the public because of the virus.
But there is, in terms of French, there you go. And it looks like probably, yeah, I'd get a PDF of that, but there's things like that for French spelling and handwriting. And so I don't quite think they're on par with the German book. Like if you take the number of pages and the amount of material covered, but they're still great for other languages. Like look at these appendices, common abbreviations, French occupation lists. So there's vocabulary you might not have. So if you come across a spelling of something and you don't know what it is.
I've got a sample that I will send you, Chris, privately through email.
Okay.
Of a family tree for one of my husband's cousins. And it's from Poland, and it's written in an incredibly beautiful script. I cannot read it, but however, I'll send it to you because maybe perhaps you can give me some insight on it. I've actually been looking at it for a couple of years now, trying to figure it out, and maybe I can get some hints from you or some tips from you.
Oh no, I do not see Polish here. Yeah, I'll have to figure out what to do. Probably on the Family Search, it would have something about Polish handwriting, but I'll certainly take a look at the script and see. But that's kind of what you have to do. And, category languages. So let's see if we've got down here, Poland languages, oh no, letter writing guides are different. This is how to write a letter to someone seeking the records. So one of the nice things I will say, for at least from my perspective, is everything getting digitized. And we know this from vital records and genealogy, but even these old medieval manuscripts or Renaissance manuscripts, getting them digitized has been a great boon. One of my old calligraphy books had explicit instructions like these letter writing guides about how to write to a museum and get a photostat, or, it was more like a photographic copy of a manuscript page that you wanted to study. And, now probably at the library or museum, they've digitized it and put it online. And that's been very helpful, I think, for medievalists. And, maybe that you might find some genealogical information there, depending on the library.
Great tips. You mentioned, there was something that kind of piqued my curiosity. You mentioned the Esther book catalog. Was that catalog specifically only to sell pins, or what exactly was that?
Esterbrook was a pen company. So at that point in the catalog, they were mostly selling nibs and dip pens. And to a certain point, they got into the fountain pen game. And the big model is the Esterbrook J. And their selling feature was you could unscrew, you had a modular nib system. So you could unscrew the nib, drop in a different nib, or you could just buy the nib, which would be cheaper than the price of the pen.
Great.
They've also been kind of durable. Like the J was a lever filler. So it had like a little lever that would press a piece of steel that would squeeze a rubber sack. And on a lot of these pens, these rubber sacks have ossified and gotten brittle and just shatter upon use. Or even worse, they haven't shattered on you using them, but sometime in the past, and they've gotten stuck to the barrel inside the pen. But a lot of those Esther books are still kind of going, like the rubber in them was thick and pliable.
Wow, that's really interesting.
But somewhere also in the bibliography is a link to an old office supply catalog that's got a couple dip pens to look at. And it also has like a hygienic finger moistener, so you don't have to lick your fingers if you lick stamps. And they've got one that's sort of fed with a reservoir like a water cooler, cut glass and beautiful. And I've never seen one in real life, but
Wow, that sounds really interesting. Well, this has been a fascinating topic for me. I mean, I just, like I said, I'm get Saturday, my one-on-one appointments quite frequently. We actually, we come across this obstacle, when we start looking at the foreign records, and this is really, giving me a lot of homework to do.
It's, it's a fair amount. What I hope for most is this is more like a toolbox, because when you're thinking local and thinking about your family and the part of the country they're in and the handwriting, it's not, you're never going to learn everything about everything for handwriting. There's no time in life to do that, but you can learn things in your little corner of the world. So what I'm hoping this is sort of like a whole bunch of guideposts that will get you to where you need to be in your little corner of the world.
Now, since so many people depend on Facebook to help them with their genealogy now, are you aware of, are there any Facebook pages for old handwriting or deciphering handwriting?
I'm not, but I could look. Occasionally where I'll see on Twitter, there will be a historian asking about a letter. And I don't know if there's any hashtag people will use, like decipher old handwriting or something like that. But I could check and see if it's on Facebook. So if there's anything, I'm not going to check now.
Okay, if you have any recommendations that you can get back to it, I'll be happy to pass that on to the class. So
I'm on a few fountain pen groups on Facebook, but there is no drama like fountain pen drama, I like to say. You would be surprised. It's always the kind of crafty niches that people have opinions on.
You're right. I never thought about that as being controversial.
Oh, they're like people, this ink stained my pen. Why did they make the ink this way? Well, you shouldn't have used that ink. What were you thinking? It literally gets like that.
Okay, well, I'm going to give the class a few more moments to put anything into the chat box that they have a question about. And then also I wanted to remind the class before we say goodbye to our guest speaker today, if you want, you can download the chat box by clicking on those three little dots. And I noticed that one of the people here in class today, Pamela, she downloaded the chat for you and she put it as a link into the chat box. So if you want to save yourself some time, just go ahead and download her saved chat text file that she put in there. And with that, what I'm going to do, Chris, is I'm going to say thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. You're second for us, and that's deeply appreciated as well. But also just to let you know that I'll be sending you the link probably within the next week or so to the YouTube video. And we want to thank you for allowing us to videotape it today as well. And let's see here. We do get some comments here. Can you see the chat box right now, or would you like me to read them?
I have my old dad's Parker pens with ink need to refab. Let's see, fountain pen, check for Facebook page. We have handouts with examples. This was a very informative lecture. Thank you. There are some, what I would do is just go, I used to have some more examples in here, but I could try and get one up, but they were just kind of random letters I had picked. There was like a letter someone wrote to John Wesley Powell that was all scrawled and said, "in haste," and that kind of thing. So I could see if I could find some examples, like at least in 18th century or 1900 script, where it would be, you know, here's something like a ligature, here's something like this. But a lot of the examples, it's sort of, you know, go to the federal census and look at that, or look at this will book and see what you can find. That's sort of what I would, you know, go to some random handwritten document in Ancestry. Some of the examples that I found, you know, I could probably just do something like a page of, look how this person makes their letter, but I'm not sure how helpful that would be. You know, because if it's something idiosyncratic, you know, you could look and see that's how that particular person in that corner, say Arizona, made their letter.
Well, Frank, that was a good question, though.
In terms of, let's see, old Parker pens with ink need to refab. Yeah, you could, there are pen repair places, and I probably should remain neutral on where you could go, but certainly Google pen repair, fountain pen repair. And you could do that. If it depends on if it's an old Parker 51. Some of those Parker 51s are still going. A lot of the repairs on the old, the ones with the rubber sacks, I can do that myself. There's a couple old Schaefers that they only made for a year or two that I far prefer. If anyone's ever heard of a Schaefer snorkel, the ones that came right before that I like a lot more, because the Schaefer snorkel was like the solution in search of a problem, and they made the ink sac almost impregnable and hard to get to, and repairing them is a beast now.
Great advice for those who are interested in pins.
Well, and it has a little metal tube inside that keeps the sac there. And I think in the old days they would open up the tube by just, you know, pulling out this little rod that comes out of the pen, the snorkel, and they'd pull it out and take the cap thing with something called it almost looked like a cup hook. You know, they'd screw it in, pull the sac out that way. And these days, that little rubber stopper, there aren't anymore. You know, the Schaefer factory in Fort Madison is not there anymore. You know, people can't get their snorkels repaired, even if it had that lifetime warranty anymore. So some of this, like Nathan Tardif, the guy who runs Noodler's Inc., also kind of designs his pens, and he's had to repair pens. So some of his you can just repair with O-rings from the plumbing section, because he's had to, you know, replace so many different things. He says, this should work you better. You know, I don't want you to have to do this. I want you to be able to keep this running in 50 years.
Great. Okay. Well, any last minute chance, anybody else want to ask a question? Throw it into the chat box or unmute your microphone, one or the other. And for those who said that they can't get the link for the downloaded chat, don't worry, I've got it. Just shoot me an email if you'd like, and I'll go ahead and send it to you later on this afternoon. Let's see here.
This is Jim.
Hi, Jim.
How are you?
Great. Go ahead and ask your question.
Well, I've got a comment. I've got a certificate that my dad earned from the Palmer Method of Business Writing from 1928. And I have the original. And he was 13 years old when he earned this. And for whatever reason, he kept it. And when he passed it away, my mom had some other stuff along with this. And I had no idea what it was for quite a while as to, you know, what the Palmer Method of Business Writing was, but I've got it framed. It's in pretty good shape. It's got a little seal down at the bottom with a couple little cloth things hanging from the bottom, gold seal. And I don't know, I thought you might get a kick out of that.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is the fountain pen people will go to old trade publications, and I don't know if Palmer had a magazine, but there was another one. I believe it's Zahner Blosser. I'm probably murdering the pronunciation and the spelling, but I think on the YAMPETH page, the Association of Master Penmen page, they have links to PDFs of old trade publications, and they're probably at archive.org or something like that these days. So, I mean, you see things like that, and it was you know, sort of a trade school that you could go into. And there were always things like about how to write faster. But as time went on, you saw less and less about script and more about typewriting. You know, Arizona's own, our eventual constitution, the actual state constitution, is typewritten.
Yeah, in the middle of this, it says has attained to a degree of excellence in the muscular movement business writing.
Yep.
So I would think that would mean speed writing.
It would be speed, but also probably the way their arms moved. And one of the drills in Palmer method just sort of looks like this series of ovals. And what you would do, or it looks all blurred now, but what you do is sort of make the big shape of a slanted O, and then go back a little bit to the right, and then to the right again, and then to the right again. But you would just keep moving your arm in that thing, and you'd want it to be almost perfectly straight and aligned. And so if you could do that, then you could kind of dip down. And I don't know if they had anything like infinity symbols, or the practice for M's and N's they call arcades, because you can just sort of start writing an M and just keep going and making that little arch shape all the way across a page. If you're trying to, you know, people think of writing as sort of like one of the, you know, to go along with reading and arithmetic, but it's a physical skill. You know, my calligraphy right now is a little out of practice, and it's something that you know, it's kind of like shooting pool. You know, you go out a stroke.
Yeah.
You know what,
Well,
Jim, Susan wanted to comment that she learned the Palmer method in the 4th grade, somewhere around 1958 to 59 in Las Vegas schools.
Oh, nice.
You can also find, I've heard people will talk about, and this is where, like, if you're an educator or into the history of education, you can find out when different scripts, you know, had their proponents or not after this, like Danielian, or there's a program now called Handwriting Without Tears, and they'll pick these scripts for specific reasons. Like I know there's some where if for people with dyslexia, they have a script set up like that where it's easier for them to read for whatever reason. Like they found statistically this particular slant or stroke works better. I've heard, for example, like loops actually diminish legibility. So like, don't put a loop at the bottom of your G or your J, just go down and make it straight, and make your Q different from a G by having the hook come back, you know, that kind of thing. That's about the only difference. Like a G is just an A with a tail that goes down, and a Q is just an A with a tail that goes down and has the hook that comes back, at least in small letters.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting. I don't think I don't recall learning the Palmer method when I was in school. I don't recall that.
The A's and Q's and things like that in the syllabus, there's a link. I think it's called Getty Dubé, but it's the Portland School of Italic Handwriting. And that was also a big thing in England in the art and craft movement, was people would learn to write italic, and they would learn to write it fast, and they would also write it joined up, but not consistently like our cursive. They would just make the joins when the letters made sense. So it was faster than printing, probably not as fast as a whole cursive, but it was very, very legible. And I think that's what the Portland School was trying to do. And the book on there, I think, is just called Write Now, WRIT.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, one last chance, class. This is the time to ask your questions. Okay, well, it sounds, Chris, like that's the end of the questions. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to just stop the recording right now, but hold on for just one moment, please.
Palmer method lessons killed my wrist. I can believe it.
Looks like Lorraine learned it that way too.
Yeah. I used to know when I was starting the semester by the amount my hand cramped up in college.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. Hold on.